We are going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully everybody can see my screen right now, and I would really appreciate it if you couldn't see my screen, that somebody might want to send me like a chat or a message so that I knew that you couldn't. All right, so I am going to get started. So today we are going to be having a discussion about eSource and clinical trials. We are going to be talking specifically about the pros and cons and lessons learned from a phase 3 global study. And I just want to point out that we are referring in this case for eSource as data that's being collected at the sites by clinicians, and we're not necessarily going to be talking about patient-reported outcomes. So we're going to be talking about the typical clinical data that's most often captured on paper and transcribed into the EDC system. And we're going to talk about a different way of approaching that, essentially to eliminate paper in that environment. All right, so what you should see here is an agenda. First, I'm going to get started by talking very briefly about the FDA's perspective on this whole thing called eSource. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of paper source versus electronic source or eSource. Then we're going to talk about the challenges and impact on the study team and particularly lessons learned. We're going to be looking at a cost analysis, and then I will be answering some of the questions that have either come to me through email or hopefully I get some also during the actual session. So like I mentioned earlier, I can't hear you, and so if you would like to ask a question, I really encourage you to do so at any time. You can just type it in the question box. I'll probably try to reserve the questions for the end just to keep things running smoothly. All right, so the definition of source, of course, is the initial documentation of data in a clinical study. And like we talked about earlier, most often our source data is being captured on paper. And however, the FDA guidance, which actually they just released a new version of the guidance on eSource, I believe in November or December of last year, the major takeaway is that the FDA is actually encouraging and supporting the use of eSource. And they clearly outline the benefits, which are probably pretty obvious to most people on the call, that it eliminates the duplication of data, reduced transcription errors. It actually promotes the entry of the source data during the patient visit versus sometime later, and it ensures the accuracy and completeness of data, and we can do that by building rules and that sort of thing around each data element as it's captured. So first we're just going to quickly talk about the existing problems with paper source, and pretty much all of these topics will kind of go into more detail on how they can be solved by using electronic source. So one of the main issues, of course, is excessive queries, delayed access to the data, the extra amount of time to actually come to data lock, the inconsistency of the way that the data is captured at the sites, difficulty in enforcing medical standards, and we'll go into some examples about that. And then probably most importantly, especially to some of the senior staff members, would be the excessive costs and overhead involved with using paper source and transcription into an EDC for your studies. All right, so the pros. So I have to try to be fair here and talk about the pros when you're using paper. And in our experience and working with different study teams, the one thing is just the familiarity to the study team members. That's the main pro about using paper, and of course just the processes that are already in place, although they might not be the best processes, you know, we have to face the fact that they already exist and they're built around paper. And of course, paper gives the sites a lot of flexibility to basically capture data differently from one site to the next. And people always have questions about the adoption of the eSource solution at the sites, and we can talk a little bit more about that as well. some of the cons of paper, I think it's pretty obvious that the con would be that it would require transcription, which is extra work. The costs associated with source data verification, having monitors come on site to actually verify the data. The significant time delay to access the patient data because it might be on paper for some time before it's actually transcribed. And then the big issue of having incomplete data, which of course translates into a high number of queries. And that's able to be solved by using electronic source. All right, so some of the pros, and there are many. The first and the most obvious and probably the biggest pro for most of the study teams is the fact of the money that's saved, because you can completely eliminate transcription and source data verification. You can implement remote monitoring. Of course, you probably can't eliminate all of your monitoring visits, but you certainly can implement a remote monitoring strategy. Your study team will have immediate access to data, which means they can be proactive about issues that might be coming up. There's an improved data quality with checks as the source data is being recorded. The medical standards are enforced, and what I mean by that is that let's just say, for example, one of the medical standards in this particular study is that they don't want you to treat the patient if they have temperature over a certain amount or a vital sign outside of a certain boundary. Well, when you're doing things on paper, you can't really enforce those types of rules. But when you're capturing the visit and an electronic source, you can actually monitor these things in real time. So if the clinician, for example, captures that the patient has this particular vital out of bounds, the system can prompt the nurse or the clinician not to treat the subject that day, and that would all be tracked and reported as part of the source documentation, electronic source documentation. And then in our experience, the queries will drop drastically, over 70%, and we've come up with methodologies for actually increasing that to over 90%. And that's very simply because the data is complete and the data is accurate, and so there's not necessarily a reason to be firing off queries. The cons would be primarily, in our experience, is that the obvious con is that it requires introducing a new system to the study team. There's usually some resistance there just because of the unknowns and the fact that it will require changes to existing process and procedures, which we talked about just a moment ago. And then the other thing is that most of the larger studies that we've worked on and supported still required an EDC interface. The sponsors weren't necessarily ready to abandon the EDC because of all the other functions and uses that were of the EDC system itself, and so there's an integration that's required there. All right, so I did say that we would talk about a real-life study, a phase 3 global study. I can tell you that this study is, actually there's multiple studies that are similar, but this particular study that we're going to talk about is, I believe, in 10 different countries around the world, and including Asia and Japan, primarily Europe, but there's also some Asian countries as well. The study requires that nurses actually travel to visit patients in their homes, and the reason being is that patients are being infused at homes. They're also being infused at the site as well, but these are some of the unique requirements that kind of prompted the sponsor to reach out and look for an eSource type of solution. The study required 72-hour follow-up by the site coordinator, so as you can imagine, if you were doing this on paper and you had a nurse going to a subject's home and you wanted the data back to the site within 72 hours, to be reviewed and followed up by the site coordinator, that required faxing and so on and so forth, and there was a lot lost in the paper. It would be incomplete, things would be missing. Previous difficulties obviously were the accuracy of the completeness of data, the timeliness of data availability, the faxing I just mentioned, and then the medical standards are very difficult to be enforced or monitored because you had nurses traveling outside of the site that you know, maybe didn't understand the protocol as well as some of the nurses in the sites. And then the other requirement is that they wanted to be able to track that the AE was followed up by the investigator within 24 hours. So those were some of the things that we were up against, in addition, of course, to just capturing the data itself. So let's kind of go into a very quick overview of the system itself. So here you have a nurse and a patient at home, and of course the nurse has a tablet. You have a site that has the study coordinators and the other staff. The investigators are at the site. They're also using a tablet, and they also have access to our portal. The data should be synchronized, so if you're looking into using an eSource solution and you're considering how these things might communicate, if you have an instance where patient or nurses are going to patient's home, or you need to be able to see patient data at the site, you need to make sure that the systems are synchronized. And so we can talk if you're interested on how we're able to accomplish that, but more so I would just let you know that that is probably a very important requirement, system requirement. And then the other thing, of course, is that you have remote monitoring, so you need to make sure that the same data that is captured on these tablets are also available through a web-based interface for remote monitoring. And so in this particular study, the monitoring was also being done through the EDC. So they had the data was available through our portal and through the EDC system, because those two systems were also synchronized. So there's a lot of moving parts, as you can see here. All right, so just a very quick overview. I want to mention that when you're implementing an eSource solution, one thing that we've discovered in talking with a lot of different clients is one important thing is that the interface should not require sites to adhere to a certain workflow. And what I mean by that is that we don't really know necessarily how the sites collect the data. They might have different staff members with different jobs from one site to another. One site may operate where one person takes the vitals and another person does the rest of the interview, and you need to have the flexibility that the sites can use the electronic source solution without having to change the way they work and the way they operate. This is just for an adoption type of point of view. You want the sites to adopt this system as quickly as possible. The data that we collected in this particular study, the case report form data, or the data that was normally collected and transferred to a CRF, was the infusion data, concomitant medications, non-drug therapies and procedures, AEs, and vital signs. And then we also, of course, the system can also be designed to collect non-CRF data. In this case, we were collecting data about the investigational product itself to make sure that it was at the right temperature before it was infused, for example. And we're also verifying the physician's order just to make sure that the nurses were infusing the subject with the most recent doctor's order. Okay, some potential challenges with eSource. So the eSource system must be as flexible as paper, and we kind of talked about that earlier. So the interface must basically give the user the opportunity to jump between different things. So if they're in the middle of, treating a patient and they have an AE and they need to document it right away, they need to be able to basically jump from one screen to the next without losing information. It must allow linking between related fields. It should be intuitive and very user-friendly for quick adoption at the site. It should support ongoing updates. So let's say, for example, if there's a change to the protocol, the system should always support an ongoing update, a remote update, which is most important, so that these tablets aren't having to be returned back to the vendor, for example. It must include effective and interactive training, and so, eSource is relatively new at all the sites that we've worked with before, and so what we've learned is that the training is critical. It's a key to success, and the system must allow, it must mimic, I should say, the normal workflow for the clinician, and we'll talk about some of the key things to accomplish that on the next slide. All right, so notes. As you guys are probably all well aware that clinicians, they take notes during the visit, and the expectation is when they're doing this on paper anyways, is that the next person that sees the file can review the notes and, you know, it stays with the chart. And the eSource solution should also support this very important way of clinician communication and documentation. Moving between data groups, it's kind of what I mentioned before. It's basically jumping around from one function to the next and not losing data. And so if you're, like I said, if you're entering a ConMed and you need to go over and you forgot to do something on another screen, you need to be able to leave a screen and come back without losing data, and also should be quick and intuitive. And we've created a system for that, and I'm sure other eSource vendors hopefully have as well, but we found that to be very important, and our clients really seem to like that feature that we offer. Edits, of course, as you know, if you're doing something on paper, there's edits, there's changes to data occasionally, and so the eSource system must support these types of edits, but more importantly, it has to include the appropriate audit trail. So it has to capture and, of course, keep the original data when it was entered, who entered it, and then, of course, when the data is changed, who changed it, when they changed it, and more important, just as importantly, why they changed it. Sharing. So as you know, if you have a patient file at a site, you share the file from one person to the next, and the eSource solution needs to support the same type of phenomenon. And they basically, you know, that was something that was easier to think about than to actually implement. And of course, we were able to implement a solution for that by allowing a user to basically be changed mid-visit. And the audit trail will still support the original data that was entered, and then when the user changes, you see that there's a new user for that visit, and what data was captured by that new user, what data is linked to that new person or new user. And so basically the most important thing is that the system should allow the sharing of patient files at the site and changes mid-visit. All right, so next we'll talk about some technical obstacles. I just mentioned the data sharing. So essentially what we did is we implemented a solution where there's a button at the top of the screen that says switch user, and they switch the user, and it's just that simple. They can hand the tablet off. Now I should also say, if there's multiple tablets at one site, you know, they can be used by different staff members, or one tablet can be used by the same staff member. So, you know, I won't get into all the details of how that works, but the system should certainly support multiple users on one device. Data transmission, it's very key and very critical, especially when you're dealing with a global type of study, that you need to ensure that the data transmission works even in a site where Wi-Fi might not be available. The way that we've overcome that obstacle is by offering a cellular communication option. So the data is transmitted using 3G, 4G, but of course Wi-Fi is always available as a backup. So that's how we've dealt with that. That keeps our system synchronized, so the tablets are essentially talking to each other, and the data is shared between the tablets and our web portal. Remote data access. Of course, the data needs to be available off-site, and that's accomplished, of course, by the synchronization that I just mentioned, and it's published on our portal through different reports and that sort of thing. Effective alerts. So the other thing that's probably important when you're implementing an eSource type of solution is that you can take advantage of having this technology. So for example, if an AE is captured that the user indicates that it may be related to the investigational product, and you want the investigator to be alerted of that right away. You know, the eSource solution should also include an effective alert process, and in our case we do email alerts, and so we can also do text message alerts as well, where key staff members can be alerted based on basically any out-of-bound or any type of field that you want to link to an alert, whether it's an out-of-bounds vital sign, an adverse event, and so on. Those can all trigger alerts, which I think have become very handy for the sites in terms of managing the study as well. All right, so what's the impact? How does this affect the study team? Clearly, the benefit is that there's no SDV. And so the data is essentially verified by the user before it's being submitted to the database. And so the other thing I should mention is that we've been able to implement a feature where, for example, a vital sign is out of bounds. And you alert the user the vital sign is out of bounds, but it is what it is, and it's a true uh, value. And so instead of allowing that to be followed up with a query, which would probably be the normal process, we can build in an interface where the user would actually have to put a reason why, they're continuing with the treatment even though the vital sign is out of bounds, for example, if that's allowed. And so it's basically another way to avoid queries. There's significant less time cleaning the data, and then the obvious reasons for the lower queries would be that there's no missing data, it's always legible, it's always complete, it's always consistent, which I think are a lot of the main reasons why we see queries in our studies now. Of course, especially for the data management team, there's more data. It comes a lot sooner and at a faster rate. They have to take a more proactive approach versus reactive, but luckily it decreases the time to lock the database. The other impact is that you most likely want to integrate into an EDC database, and the reason why we've had this is what I mentioned before. The studies that we've supported so far have still wanted an EDC integration, and so we've been able to develop that with a lot of the major EDC vendors. And I just have one quick slide about the EDC integration. This little picture down here on the bottom shows the tablet and the portal synchronized, being pushed to the eSource database, the eSource vendors database, and then being pushed to the EDC system. So this is basically the way the SysTech architecture looks. So the reason why, of course, for EDC integration is the reluctancy to abandon the EDC system, and it's been critical for, at least for our team, to support this integration to maintain the site workflow for other tasks that are historically completed using the EDC system. And that's required a lot of collaboration between the EDC vendor and the eSource vendor. All right, so now the fun stuff. Cost benefits. So this is an example of a real study here. And so this is an example that SysTech did in terms of the analysis. And so the cost benefits are going to focus on a few key areas, and that would be SDV elimination and query reduction. So I should point out that there's a lot of assumptions that are being made in this cost analysis, and I can say that the assumptions aren't just our own personal assumptions at SysTech, but they're supported by industry research or various publications, and we can certainly provide citations or the references for these assumptions for anybody on the call that's interested. And the other thing that we've done for a lot of people that are kind of interested in exploring eSource is giving them a sample of a cost savings for their study if they had basically what we need to understand initially is the total data elements, the number of patients, those types of things, which we can work with you on that if you are interested. So, but back to this particular study. So this study, I believe, I don't have it on the slide, and I believe that they were screening over 800 patients and enrolling about 400. I could be wrong there, though, but the most important point is that the total number of data elements for this particular study for all the subjects through the life of the study was going to be just over 2 million data elements. With the query rate of 2%, of audit for the automated queries we're talking about, not the queries associated with SDV, but your automated queries. And we're talking, of course, this is an example of what you would probably see using paper. And that would give you about 30,000 automated queries. Our assumption is that we can reduce that by about 90%, which would leave the sponsor with a savings of about $679,000. That's just from the savings just for queries alone on the automated type of queries that are usually fired off in your EDC system. And those are, of course, eliminated by using an eSource solution just based on all the rules that we can build around each data element as it's captured. Secondly, I'm going to go into the monitoring or the elimination of source data verification. So we took two approaches here. Our research indicated that SDV was typically about 33%, accounted for about 33% of the study budget. And so, you know, we thought that might seem a little high. We weren't really sure, and so we went ahead and did it with another method as well. But using the method of 33% of your budget being attributed to monitoring and source data verification, if your budget is about $20 million, you're looking at $6.6 million that you're basically paying to whoever is doing this SDV for you. Method number two is basically just saying, okay, now we're going to let's just look at the cost of the queries due just to the SDV. So during SDV, they're verifying that the data is correct, that the transcription doesn't include errors. And so during our research, we discovered that the transcription error rate is about 10%. So during this whole SDV process, the assumption can be made that on 2 million different data elements, they're going to probably discover 200,000 transcription type of errors. And, you know, this is a big study, so these numbers may seem high, but this is just the reality. And then at a cost per query of $25 again, which is very conservative, that would be about $5 million savings. It's pretty significant. So in this particular study, there's the potential to save $5.6 to $7.2 million. And, you know, obviously there's the assumption that, you know, you've worked out these details maybe with your CRO ahead of time and they understand that this study is going to be using eSource. And, you know, we're kind of getting there with some of our customers, but that's not an easy tradition to change or process to change, I guess I should say. So your next question is probably, well, how much does that eSource solution cost? Well, I could tell you that it's not $5.6 million, and it's like very significantly less than that. So, of course, there's different variables for our pricing, but it's certainly not in that range. So, looks like I finished a little bit early. It's about 10:30 right now, which leaves us a half hour for questions. I was trying to leave 20 minutes for questions, but that's fine. But just in summary, I just would like to say that although implementing an eSource solution will require basically rejigging your current internal processes built around paper and EDC, the cost analysis and the basic value proposition for data quality, it simply can't be ignored. And so it's something that's around the corner. All right, and I should mention that a lot of people have emailed me and asked me if there's going to be a recording, that they might be on the call, but some of their colleagues won't be, and they'd like to share the recording of the presentation. And I'm hoping that I pushed the right buttons correctly and that this is indeed recording, but this is our first time using GoToWebinar. So worst case, I will email the presentation if you'd like it. Best case, there'll be a recording available that I'll email you guys, and you can hopefully click on a link and get to it if you'd like to see it. I'll also email all the Q&A to all the attendees in case we don't get through all of them during the call. All right, so first I'm going to start with the questions that came through as people were registering for the meeting. One of the questions was, how do you handle multi-center trials? Like, for example, if some centers or sites don't want to use eSource. And so this is a good question. And I can tell you that in our experience, it might be the case that there's a slow adoption rate. We haven't had the experience where there's been a flat-out refusal to use the eSource system. And in fact, most people are pretty excited about it. But we do have to address the fact that a site might be wanting to capture the data on paper initially, and the way that we've been able to address that is that we can indicate in our system which data was paper. So if they want to write it on paper at one site, you know, fine. They can do it on paper and then transcribe it into our system. We have a data capture obviously on our tablet, but it's also available through our web portal. They can transcribe it, and the system would basically have a field that indicates, okay, this is a paper source, it needs to be source data verified. The next question, which devices do you use? At Assistech, we primarily use Android tablets, 10-inch Android tablets, and that's worked very well for us. Who sets up the system? Assistech essentially delivers a complete solution to the sites, and so basically they'll get a tablet that would be delivered to the site that's already pre-configured with the software, languages, etc., that are necessary for that particular study. And so we do all the setup. The next question is, which data cannot be directly collected via eSource? So I can tell you now that we're basically in the infant early stages of integrating outside data sources, like, for example, labs is one thing that we're asked about quite a bit. Can we import the labs? And so we're trying to work on right now piloting a study for integrating outside data sources. I'm hoping that I'm answering your question correctly. So I don't know that there's necessarily data that can't be directly collected via the eSource, but I can tell you that right now our system is supporting the collection of any type of CRF or non-CRF data, but importing the data is something that we're working on for specific clients, including importing data from other devices, medical devices, for example, that sort of thing. Hold on for 1 second while I read some of these questions. All right, the next question is, using eSource, can the CRA complete the source data verification for all the sites without traveling? So I think hopefully I already answered that question, is that the CRA is actually not going to have to do the source data verification. And so in our experience, there will still be some tasks for the monitor that they have to complete at the site, and they'll still have to visit the site, but there's certainly is a reduction in the on-site visits. Can a data coordinator be able to, or is the data coordinator able to view the eSource data? Essentially is what the question, hopefully I'm reading that correctly. And yes, the team, the study team or the team at the site can view the eSource data through our portal. So if they don't have a tablet handy, they can jump on our portal and pull different reports and see the data that was captured as the electronic source. What are the different tools available? I think I answered that about the Androids, and that's what we're using right now. Of course, I should also mention, in our experience, it's been really important that we customize the software based on the study requirements. And so typically a sponsor will provide us obviously with the protocol and some sample case report forms, and from there we'll be able to customize the system based on the protocol requirements. Okay, the next question is, I have a question about how the external data lab, IVRS, spirometry, etc. will be handled, and how will the variables be compatible with CDISC. I think I answered the question about the external labs. We're working on doing that type of integration, same with medical devices. And I can tell you that the data that we push to the EDC or to the sponsor database is all CDISC compatible, and so we're good to go there. The next question, I think I might have to follow up on email. I believe that the person was asking more from an ePro point of view. I don't know if Ann Thompson's on the line right now, but if she wants to chat me another question or clarify. But the question seems to be more about PRO. So Ann, if you're on the line, you can maybe go ahead and maybe we can chat about that on email. All right. The next question I see here is, does the study require that the eSource be in the local language? Okay, so I have a kind of two answers for that, and that's that we basically will customize the system based on how the sponsor wants the sites to see the questions. And so we typically, of course, our company also does diaries and patient-reported outcomes. And so in that case, the expectation is obviously that the patient will see their diary or their PRO in their native language, and we do all the translations in-house here. But for the eSource solution or the direct data capture for the sites, it's gone both ways. And essentially, it seems that most of the sponsors would prefer that the system be in English. And so that's how we've implemented it. It doesn't mean that we can't implement it in the user's native language, because we've certainly done that. In fact, we've translated to over 46 different languages around the world, and the nice thing about the system that we're using now is that the keyboard would be in the user's native language, and that's all integrated as part of the Android operating system. And in fact, we have one study right now that's ongoing that supports 32 different languages, and it's crazy. But in any case, I guess the answer is yes, that we can do it. This particular study, they didn't do it in the user's native language. However, they did want, in one particular study, they wanted the user guide and the training in the user's native language, but the system itself was going to be in English. And that's what the sponsor requested. And that's what we did, and it seems to have worked fine for them. We haven't heard otherwise, but that's how it was used. All right, so now I'm trying to see if I got other questions. Okay, another question. What if the subject's house does not have internet access? So if the subject's house does not have internet access, meaning the cellular access, let's say they live somewhere really remote and there's no access to cellular communications, the subject does not have Wi-Fi, and that's basically the worst case scenario. The good thing about our software is that it allows the user to still capture data regardless of whether or not there's internet access available. And so I didn't mention this earlier, but the way that our system works, I don't know how other systems work, but I can say that the way that the Systex system is developed is that the software is native to the device. It's running on the device independent of the internet. And so it's an application that automatically comes on when the user turns on the tablet. It's the only application that they can access on the tablet just to maintain the integrity of the data. And if there's no Wi-Fi or there's no internet access, no 3G or 4G cellular communications, they will go ahead, they'll enter the data onto the tablet. As soon as that tablet hits an area in which there is communication, it will automatically synchronize. And so the system's designed to know that there's data that needs to be synchronized, and it does it as needed, essentially. I answered the question about the copy. Okay. How was other notes? There's one question I couldn't get. I'll have to follow up with email. Are fields communicated as the field is completed? I think, hopefully I get this correct, I think you're asking, as the fields are completed, does it automatically push the data directly to the EDC? And hopefully, or to the final database. Essentially, as a user is completing the fields, there'll be prompts like, let's say, for example, one particular field that they're entering is a ConMed, let's say, and they forget to put in the dose or something like that, and they'll be prompted immediately as they complete it, oh, you missed this field, or you need to complete this, or this is out of range, or whatever the case is. And then the data is actually pushed to the database after the visit's over. And so as soon as they say, okay, this visit's complete, they complete their electronic signature, the data gets pushed to our database, and then depending on basically the study itself, it either gets pushed directly to the EDC or it's reviewed at different levels before it gets pushed, and that's something that we customize with the sponsor. Oh, I just saw the next question. He's talking about, is it pushed to the backend database as the fields are completed? And the answer is no. It's after the visit is complete, then it's pushed to the backend database. Okay, what EDC vendors have you integrated into the eSource system? We have integrated with a lot of the big ones, including Metadata Rave and Oracle Inform, other Oracle databases. We've integrated with DataTrack. We've integrated with over, I think it's 20-something different databases, so it's something that we're very experienced at, and we have a whole process and SOPs built around how we do that, including different technical specifications, data dictionaries, data transfer agreements, and so on. I won't go into all those details, but we've been very successful there. The edit checks are run in real time on the device. So the question is, where and when are the edit checks run? So they're run in real time on the device itself. The next question is, what is the recovery rate of the tablets after the study is complete? That's a good question, and we get that a lot. Usually people ask us, what's the loss rate of the tablet after the study is over? How many tablets are lost or just not returned? And the loss rate is about 2%. Actually, it's just under 2%. I think it's 1.8% is the loss rate. So it's pretty negligible, and I think the reason is because nobody can figure out how to get out of the software, and then the tablet doesn't seem very exciting after that. Now it's just a tablet that runs some clinical software. It doesn't seem very fun, and so all the buttons, all the ports, everything is locked down so the user can't exit our software. The next question, what is the average time to set up a database using this eSource method? So it takes us anywhere from to develop an eSource solution, I would say about 10 to 12 weeks, maybe 10 to 14 weeks, and that includes setting up the actual eSource solution and the back-end integrations as well. Okay, I think I answered there was another question about the labs. I think I already answered that. The next question is, does the sponsor purchase the tablets? And the answer is that the sponsor does purchase the tablets, but not directly. And so AssistTech, as part of the contract, will secure the tablets, and the sponsor will buy them from us, but we offer a buyback option at the end of the study, depending on the length of the study. If the study is very, very short, which is rare, let's say less than a year or something like that for the entire study, we might do a lease option if that makes more sense. And so we're flexible in that area, but we do offer buyback options, which makes the hardware cost relatively negligible. The next question is, who has access to the eSource data and who controls access? So the entire study team has access to the data in terms of from a view role. So there's different, how do I say this? Basically, as users are set up on our system, they are set up with different roles and responsibilities and different levels of permission or access. So let's say, for example, the sponsor might would of course have a different role than a study coordinator would have versus a monitor versus an investigator. And so I think hopefully that answers your question, but we work out all those rules with the sponsor in terms of who they want having access to what data, and we set the permissions up as the new users are enrolled on the system. By user, do you mean site staff is the next question. And yes, so the user is typically somebody at the site. Yes. And we're talking about the devices at the site. So yes, of course, in studies where we're supporting patient-reported outcomes, the user would be the patient, but I should be clear that I'm talking about the site staff, so that could be a nurse, a study coordinator, an investigator. The monitors typically don't use the tablets, they use our portal. How do the edit checks fire offline? So the edit checks are part of the software, I guess, is the only way to say it. So if the device is not online, meaning that there's no 3G or 4G communication, it certainly does not affect how the edit checks are fired off. The next question is, how was the non-CRF data collected? The non-CRF data was collected in the same fashion, basically through the tablet itself. And so, for example, the IP verification, there was a series of questions that the site staff or the nurse had to answer before they treated the subject to verify that the investigational product was at the correct temperature and that the different tag alerts that were associated with that particular IP had either gone off or not gone off. And so there were a series of questions, and based on how the user answered those questions, they were able to treat the subject. And so those questions were built into the software, and they're answered essentially in the same way as any other data field was answered. Now, in terms of the data being integrated in the back end with the EDC or the sponsor database, hopefully I'm saying this correctly, but I think in this case the sponsor wanted that particular data not to go into the EDC, and it was pushed into a sponsor database instead of being pushed to the EDC. And so each data element is basically analyzed at the beginning to determine how it will get pushed from our system to the sponsor system. The next question is, how is the data archived at the site after the tablets are returned? And so we provide the sites with all the electronic source data on a CD. There was one other question I think that I had skipped earlier, and it was about how do you basically avoid conflicts if you have a doctor and a clinical study person entering data at the same time. And so that happens very rarely. I know we have different rules built into the database on our end that does checks to see which data would win in that situation, but I should tell you that we have a data management team that does quality checks before the data is actually pushed to the sponsor database to basically look for these rare scenarios. And it is something that you have to be aware of. And so before the data is pushed, we have different checks and rules that we do for things exactly like this, which would be conflicts in data and also corrupt data. And so although we we do validations to make sure that the data transmissions are clean and that sort of thing, because we realize we're in the real world and there can be corruptions to data, we do have checks for that as well before the data is pushed to the end database. The next question is, can the investigator take notes on the tablet? And the answer to that is yes, they can take notes on the tablet just like anybody else could take notes on the tablet. I don't believe in this particular study that we just talked about there was a role for the investigator to do notes, but if that's something that you are interested in, I suppose that would be something that we would just have to customize on your system. All right, I think that's all the questions. And I hope I didn't talk too fast. I feel like I did, but this is my first webinar, and so I would appreciate any feedback. I will certainly be collecting all of these questions and sending them out to everybody with answers, just in case you weren't able to hear them all. And I will also follow up, as I mentioned earlier, with a recording. And so with that, if there's no other questions, there's one more question. How does the data, essentially, how does the data get merged with the electronic medical records? And so that's another topic that's been pretty interesting for us, and that we've been working with a few major sponsors on trying to solve this problem of basically integrating the EMR or EHR data with our system, not necessarily in the context of notes, but just more in a general sense. And I can tell you that AssistTech is working feverishly at piloting some studies to integrate the EHR data with our system. And so It's not something that we've done yet, and I guess we've been lucky so far that this has not been an issue on the studies that we've supported thus far, but we understand moving forward it's something that needs to be addressed, especially for specific therapeutic areas where there's a lot of data in the EMR or the EHR that needs to be also available in the clinical trial database. And so we're working on that integration directly without any transcription. And hopefully actually we'll pilot that study this year. And so I guess you'd have to stay tuned. How does the I'm sorry for the person who just asked the question, I don't know what the acronym HX stands for. So if you want to ask again or clarify, or maybe we can just chat offline. Oh, how does the med history get into the source? And so to answer that question, I think and a lot of times that medical history is in the EHR, and so we've had to either transcribe that data into our system, and like I said earlier, we're working on doing an integration with the EHR. The next question is, how many studies has a SysTech completed using eSource? None of the studies have actually completed, but we have 4 ongoing global studies that are using this direct data capture system, and we have over 100 different studies under our belt in other eSource areas, including patient-reported outcomes, electronic diaries, and that sort of thing. So, but as far as doing the clinical type of data that we just discussed during this presentation, our experience has been 4. They've all been either phase 2 or phase 3, and they've all been global studies. So, you know, we jumped right into it. We didn't waste any time doing any small studies. So it's been interesting for us. The next question is, if the medical history is transcribed, does it need to be SDV'd? Yes, of course. If there's something that's transcribed, it would need to be SDV'd. That's, you know, that's where we talked earlier very briefly about if there's data that's transcribed into our system, the system would basically indicate that that data was a transcribed type of data element. If it's something like medical history that was captured in the EHR, but in our experience so far, it's such a small percentage of the data that it hasn't been an issue. However, it's something that we're working for integration. The next question I can't answer. What sponsors have you worked with so far? I'm sorry, that's not something that we can publicly say, but we have worked with large pharmaceutical companies. And I can tell you that we've been involved in over 30 different sponsor audits successfully. So I guess that's it. The last question I'll probably have to answer offline because I would need to ask somebody. Somebody asked me a question about during site audits, do the sites use the tablets to retrieve the source data for the auditor? I don't know the answer to that, but somebody here in our company certainly does, and I will follow up on an email with that. Have you worked with medical device companies? And the answer to that is yes, we have worked with medical device companies. All right. I think, are there any other questions? I'd be happy to stay online and answer more questions if you'd like. All right. Well, thank you everybody so much. I really appreciate it. And like I said, it's been our first webinar using this tool, so hopefully it worked okay for everybody. But I'd appreciate your feedback if there was something that didn't work very well, or if you couldn't hear me well, or anything like that. I would really appreciate the feedback. And I will certainly follow up with everybody with answers to these questions and a link hopefully to the recording. And thanks again, and I hope you guys have a great end of your week. We're almost there. It's Thursday. All right, thanks everybody.